So I got some bad news for Xbox fans, and again, it's pretty kind of obvious what the news is. But I was excited for Avowed. I thought, maybe this was going to be a huge game that kind of helps Xbox. And the more I think about it, the more I think that it's not going to be that, right? It's a game that is going to get more criticism for the Xbox Series X, considering we bought the most powerful console ever, and the standard was going to be 60 frames per second. Now, to see stuff like this is very, very frustrating and feels very lazy. And I'm going to get into it just now, and hopefully you guys are going to, understand where I'm coming from this. Is not a point of hate or anything like that. I just kind of wanted to talk about it, but let's get started. What's up, everybody? I'm Crap Gamer. This is Crap Gamer Reviews with another video. Please take time out of your day to hit that like button and maybe even, subscribe. That would be pretty cool as well. So according to this, Avowed is targeting 30 frames per second. He says you don't necessarily need that 60 frames. Now, I take very, very, very big objection to that, because so far what I've seen from Avowed, it definitely doesn't look like it's a game that's going to melt faces with graphical settings and things like that. So the fact that on the Xbox Series X they can't do that makes you kind of think that it's really being lazy. So speaking on the Iron Lords podcast, art director Matt Henson called 30 frames per second the bare minimum the team is aiming for. He said it's a first-person single-player game. You don't necessarily need that 60 frames, and that allows us to go a lot juicier with the VFX and lighting and all that other stuff. It's a trade-off. We opted to make it relatively early, and we're happy with that. The game's running pretty smooth for how visually dense it is, and it was always our goal. Originally scheduled for later this year, Avowed will now be released in 2025. Xbox had planned a 2024 release for the game, with a blog post by developer Obsidian seemingly accidentally confirming a November 12th release before it was removed. However, a message posted by the official Xbox account on X has confirmed that the game will now be released on February 18th, 2025. The game's director, Carrie Patel, recently claimed that the game has more than 10 endings. They added, "I can tell you our ending slides numbers in the double digits. You can end up with a lot of different combinations of them." Now, Avowed was announced in early 2020 as a first-person fantasy action RPG set in the world of Eora, which was originally introduced in Pillars of Eternity, and they said the game will be similar in like to Obsidian's previous games, The Outer Worlds. Now, let me say this real quick, okay? This is very lazy saying, "Oh, you don't need that." It's a first-person game. There's shooting involved. Of course you need, 60 frames per second. I don't see why they don't actually offer that as something that you can do. Like, it's a real shame to me that these things aren't happening the way that you would suspect them to happen. Now, for me, I really do think that it's something that Microsoft should be better at, because they promised us one thing and they delivered something else. Now, here's the thing: if 30 frames per second was fine, right, and this is the biggest kind of thing that I can say about this, if playing this game at 30 frames per second was fine, then why are all of the previews and the Gamescom people that are allowed to play this game, why are all those played on PC at 60 frames, right? So that's the big question I have. And here's the other thing: Xbox Series X has one of those situations where they're in a bad problem, because they're getting smashed by Nintendo, they're getting smashed by Sony, they're getting smashed by everything that possibly could be, and that's a real problem. I feel like they have a real issue with this, and again, listen, I'm not trying to hate for the sake of hating, but think about this: the games that we've gotten this generation haven't been that great. The ones that are the current gen only, right? Whatever the case may be, like, there's been some stumbles along the way. There's been some decent ones and some good ones, but nothing that I would consider to be like amazing at this point. And the fact of the matter is, the current gen only games that Microsoft has released, let's talk about it real quick. So we've got Hellblade 2, which was 30 frames per second. Yes, it looked very great, but it was also incredibly linear. We got Redfall, which released at 30 frames per second and was a bad game. They later patched it to 60. That game should have been 60 right from the start. You look at Starfield. Oh, we couldn't do that. And then now all of a sudden they patched it to 60 on Series X and S, right? It's like they don't really take the time to optimize for their console, and that's really a problem that a lot of people have. So now that we know that they're aiming for 30 frames per second here, people are starting to see some really heated discussion on a topic on whether it's becoming a bit of an issue for Xbox. Microsoft's last three major first-party releases, with Forza aside, have all launched at 30 frames per second. And with Avowed being added to the list next February, is this becoming a problem? Should Microsoft be offering more on day one? We say day one because with Redfall and Starfield, they've since had the 60 frames mode added, so there's clearly the ability to make this happen post-launch. However, the team just doesn't seem to be getting such modes ready to go for release, and in some instances, players are having to wait almost 6 months to play their chosen first-party game at 60 frames per second on current gen Xbox. While we think this trend is a bummer, it's kind of crazy. A lot of people chose higher frame rates where possible, and I think most people do that. The topic is more, maybe a little bit more nuanced than it appears. You've got to think that this is the first wave of games that are being properly built for the Series X and S. Prior first-party launches such as Halo Infinite and Forza Horizon 5 are Xbox One games, so that means visuals are being pushed in those more recent titles, as well as frame rates are suffering as a result. Now, when you compare this to the main competitor, the PlayStation 5, this is an even more important point. Yes, Sony has done much better job so far offering multiple performance modes in its first-party games, but a lot of those were originated in the PlayStation 4 era, much like Infinite and Forza Horizon 5 examples. Gran Turismo 7, God of War Ragnarok may offer high frame rate modes, but they're both cross-gen 2, while the likes of The Last of Us Part 1 and Part 2 Remastered were older games to start with. So anyway, but I will say this, right? Even stuff like Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, they had multiple options. Spider-Man 2, multiple options. Even, you know what I'm saying? And when you look at a game like, listen, I'm no Horizon Forbidden West fan at all. But when you look at Horizon Forbidden West, that game melts faces graphically, right? So, again, I feel like we're in this very weird situation where Xbox is kind of screwing the fans, and sure, they might add a 60 frames to this later or whatever, but it's the same situation with like Indiana Jones and some of these other games. It's like these games are going to probably run better on PS5 Pro, and that's a real shame because we all bought into the most powerful console and we aren't really getting that, right? Like Microsoft isn't even taking time to develop properly for their own platform, which is a real shame. Now, they delayed this game. You're telling me in the months and months delay, like right now, supposedly this game is done and ready. You're telling me in, the next 6 months they can't add a 60 frames option? That's pretty ridiculous in my opinion. I'm not one to really usually complain about that. I can even understand Hellblade 2, with what they were doing there. There isn't a lot of flow in combat. You only are ever taking on one person at a time. So I can see what they were trying to go for, push the visuals, which they did. That really comes across as more of a game that kind of in my opinion is a tech demo. Like, that would have been a good game to launch on Xbox Series X, and I don't think people would have cared as much, because it's showcasing what the platform can do. Now, when it comes down to, these other things, I think that's where we come into a little bit of an issue. So, I think that we are starting to see a problem where, Microsoft's games are very much under delivering what they're supposed to be, and it's like you go, oh well, Forza Motorsport. I gotta say this, right? I'm a motorsport fan. Of course, I prefer the Horizon series, but Forza Motorsport, this reboot or whatever the hell it was, is not a good game, right? I do not understand how that game took 6 years to make, and I don't understand why they were able to put out much better games on a bi-yearly basis, considering what we see here. Right, that is like, I don't know, that I uninstalled that game, right? Like, it's probably the first Forza Motorsport game that I am not going to put just an absolute ton of hours into. And I gotta say, the reasons being is because that game just isn't fun to play. It's kind of a hassle, and I think racing games should be fun. and that game really kind of underdelivered as well with kind of what we were all looking for and hoping for. So I hope that we can get something better in the future. But again, I don't know that I trust Microsoft at this point. Like they sold us this console most powerful, and then all their first party games for this gen only have been pretty much 30 frames. So I don't know. Let me know what you guys think. I'll link this in the description. Rack 'em up. Crap Gamer out.